Lira Ashworth woke at midnight with a fire on her shoulder. It was not a real fire, there was no smoke and no flame, but the pain felt just as sharp, just as cruel. She pressed her hand against the old mark on her skin, the one that had connected her to her mate for 3 years, and she understood what had happened before any servant could come to tell her. Somewhere in the palace, in a room not far from her own, King Draven Calloway had placed a new mark on another woman. Lira had heard stories about this kind of pain. The elders called it the broken thread. They said it only happened when a mate's bond was betrayed, when a wolf gave their mark to someone new, while another still wore the first one. She had always believed such stories were rare, things that happened to other people, in other kingdoms, in other lives. She never thought she would feel it herself, lying alone in the dark, her whole body shaking from a wound no one else could see. She did not cry. She did not scream. She simply sat up in bed, looked at the moonlight falling across the stone floor, and made a decision. She would not wait for an explanation. She would not stand in front of the court and ask her husband to explain himself, while every noble in the room watched her face for signs of weakness. She had been Queen of Blackthorn for 3 years, and in that time she had learned one important lesson. A wolf who stays to be hurt again is not loyal. She is simply afraid. By the time the sun rose, Lira was gone. She left behind her crown, her fine dresses, and the silver ring Draven had given her on their wedding day. She took only a worn cloak that had belonged to her mother, a small hunting knife, and enough coin to last a few weeks if she was careful. She slipped through a servant's door that led to the old orchard, climbed over the low wall at the edge of the palace grounds, and walked into the forest before any guard noticed her missing. Behind her, the palace woke to chaos. Draven Calloway had not marked another woman. He had spent that entire night in a meeting with his generals, planning defenses along the northern border, where a rival pack called the Thornvale had been making trouble for months. When his personal guard burst into the meeting room with the news that the queen was gone, Draven felt the world tilt beneath him. He ran to his chambers and immediately understood why Lira had left. The scent in the room was unmistakable, the scent of a stranger, layered carefully over his own bedding, his own clothes. It was not his doing. Someone had been in his chambers while he was away, and someone had used that visit to create a lie so convincing that even Lyra's own senses had been fooled. Draven was not a man who panicked easily. He had ruled Blackthorn since he was 22 years old, had survived 2 wars and a poisoning attempt by his own cousin, and had built one of the strongest kingdoms among the wolf packs through patience and careful thought. But standing in that room, smelling the proof of a betrayal he never committed, he felt something close to panic for the first time in his life. He called his advisors together. He explained what he believed had happened. Some of them doubted him at first, until the kingdom's oldest healer examined the scent more closely and confirmed what Draven already suspected. It was not a true mark. It was magic, old and dark, designed to mimic the bond between mates closely enough to fool even a king's wife. Someone wanted her to run, the healer said, and they wanted you to be blamed for it. Draven did not need to ask who would benefit from such a plan. The Thornvale pack had been trying to weaken Blackthorn's position for years. A kingdom without its queen, a king distracted by grief and suspicion, would be far easier to defeat in any future conflict. He gathered a small group of his most trusted wolves, refused the offer of a full search party, and set out after his wife alone. He did not want soldiers surrounding her when he found her. He wanted to explain himself, not to frighten her further. Lira, meanwhile, traveled for nearly 2 weeks before she felt safe enough to stop moving. She crossed through the borderlands, a stretch of wild country that belonged to no single pack, where the trees grew thick and the roads were rough and unmarked. She avoided other travelers when she could, and when she could not avoid them, she gave a false name and kept her hood low over her face. Eventually she reached a small coastal village called Hallows Bend, far from anything connected to Blackthorn. The village was quiet, made up mostly of fishing families who had little interest in palace politics or kingdom borders. No one there recognized her. No one asked questions about where she had come from, or why a woman traveling alone carried herself the way she did, with the quiet confidence of someone who had once commanded a room simply by entering it. She found work mending fishing nets for an older woman named Morella, who ran a small shop near the docks. The work was hard on her hands, which had once worn jeweled rings and signed royal decrees. But Lira found a strange comfort in it. There was something honest about repairing a net, about fixing something broken with her own 2 hands, and watching it become useful again. She told herself she was healing. She told herself the ache in her chest, the one that came at night when she lay alone, and thought of Draven's voice, of his laugh, of the way he used to trace the mark on her shoulder with gentle fingers, was simply exhaustion. It was hunger. It was the cold sea air settling into her bones. It was not love. She refused to call it love. But some nights, when the moon was full and the tide was loud against the docks, she would press her hand against her shoulder and remember how it had felt to be chosen, truly chosen, by a man who once told her that she was the only person in any kingdom who had ever made him feel less alone. Draven's search was not easy. He crossed through territories that did not welcome wolves from Blackthorn, including land controlled by packs who held old grudges against his family. In one village, he was forced to prove his strength against a local alpha, who refused to let him pass without a challenge. Draven won, but not without injury, a deep cut along his ribs that slowed his travels for several days. In another town, he met an old hedge witch who lived alone in a cottage at the edge of a swamp. She agreed to help him find his wife's trail, but only after he answered her questions honestly. She asked him why he wanted to find Lira. She asked him what he would say to her if he found her. She asked him whether he deserved forgiveness, even if he had done nothing wrong. Draven sat with those questions for a long time before answering. He admitted that he did not know if he deserved forgiveness. He admitted that even though he had not betrayed his wife, he had failed to protect her from those who wished to hurt them both. He admitted that he had let his pride keep him from telling her how much he needed her, every single day, instead of only on the days when it was easy to say. The witch seemed satisfied with his honesty. She gave him a small charm, a piece of polished stone that would grow warm whenever he moved closer to Lira's location, and sent him on his way. The trail led him through 3 more territories before he finally caught her scent near the coast. He had been hunted by another pack's scouts along the way, accused of trespassing on land that did not belong to him, and wounded again in a skirmish that nearly cost him his life. But none of it slowed him for long. He had a purpose now, clear and simple. He would not stop until he found her. It took him almost 2 months to reach Hallows Bend. He arrived at the village on a quiet afternoon, his clothes worn from travel, his face thinner than it had been when Lira last saw him. He walked along the docks, following the warmth of the charm in his palm, until he saw her sitting on a wooden bench, a fishing net spread across her lap, her hands moving steadily over the rope. For a long moment, he simply stood there and looked at her. She looked different. Her hair was shorter, tied back with a simple cloth instead of pinned with jewels. Her hands were rougher, but she was still Lira, still the woman who had once told him that she did not want a king who ruled from a throne, but a partner who ruled beside her. She felt his presence before she saw him. The mark on her shoulder, which had been quiet for 2 months, suddenly felt warm instead of painful. She looked up, and her breath caught in her throat. "Draven," she said quietly. He did not move closer right away. He stood several feet away, giving her space, his hands open at his sides to show he meant no harm. "I'm not here to force you to come back," he said. "I'm here because I needed you to know the truth. I never marked anyone else. Someone used dark magic to make it seem that way. They wanted to break us apart, to weaken the kingdom by taking you away from it." Lira set the net aside slowly. Her heart was pounding, caught between the relief of hearing that the bond was never truly broken and the lingering hurt of 2 months spent believing it had been. "How do I know that's true?" she asked, though her voice was softer than her words. "Because the mark is still here," Draven said, pulling back his sleeve to show the place on his own arm where their bond had first been formed, years ago, on the night they were joined as mates. "It never changed. Not once. If I had truly marked someone else, you would see it here, faded or broken. It's not. It never was." Lira rose from the bench and crossed the distance between them slowly, her eyes searching his face for any sign of deception. She found none, only exhaustion and worry, and a hope so plain it nearly broke her heart. "I left because I couldn't bear the thought of staying somewhere I wasn't wanted," she admitted. "I told myself it was strength. But maybe it was fear." "You had every right to leave," Draven said gently. I should have told you, every single day, how much you mattered to me. I let the crown become more important than the man underneath it. That's on me, not you. The villagers on the docks pretended not to notice the two of them standing close together, though several glanced their way with quiet curiosity. Morella, watching from the doorway of her shop, simply smiled and returned to her work, sensing this was not a moment that needed an audience. Draven did not ask her to return to the palace immediately. He told her she could take as much time as she needed, that he would stay in the village, find work on the docks if necessary, and wait until she was ready. He had crossed an entire kingdom to find her. He could wait a little longer to bring her home. But Lira did not need more time. Standing there, feeling the warmth of the bond returning fully between them, she realized that the distance she had placed between herself and Draven had never been about whether she loved him. It had been about protecting herself from a pain she believed was real. Now that she knew the truth, that pain no longer had any hold over her. Take me home, she said simply. They left Hallows Bend together 2 days later, after Lira said her goodbyes to Morella and the other villagers who had welcomed her without question. The journey back to Blackthorn was quieter than the journey that had brought them apart, filled with long conversations they had never made time for before, about fears they had hidden, about the kind of partnership they wanted to build once they returned. When they arrived at the palace gates, Lira did not walk behind her husband, as tradition might have suggested. She walked beside him, her hand in his, her head held high. The truth about the false mark eventually came to light. A spy within the Thornvale pack was captured weeks later and confessed to using forbidden magic to create the illusion that had driven Lira away. Justice was served according to the laws of the kingdom, and the matter was closed. Blackthorn welcomed its queen home, not with whispers of scandal, but with quiet relief. The bond between Lira and Draven, once nearly broken by a lie, had been tested and proven true. They ruled together in the years that followed, not as a king who commanded and a queen who obeyed, but as two people who had chosen each other, fully and freely, more than once. And on quiet nights, when the moon hung full over the palace, Lira would sometimes touch the mark on her shoulder and remember the fire she had once felt there. It no longer brought her pain. It only reminded her of how far they had traveled to find their way back to each other.